the Veil Theory had a word for her. Every civilization that had reached the stars eventually coined one, a single syllable or a string of harmonic tones pressed into whatever passed for language, and each one meant essentially the same thing: sacred, untouchable, above. The Kethare called her the luminant constant. The Dorhai sang her name in subsonic frequencies that vibrated through the bones of their young. The Salvine had constructed 11 orbital temples in her honor before they had even made first contact with her fleet. They didn't wait to meet her before deciding she was divine. The decision, for most species, seemed to happen automatically, like a reflex baked into the architecture of sapient minds that had learned to look up at the dark between stars and feel small. Her name, in the common trade tongue that had stitched together 47 civilizations over 300 years, was Ethan Vel. In human mouths, that came out sounding like a held breath followed by a whisper. Most xenolinguists agreed this was appropriate. She was old. Not metaphorically, not in the way that any sufficiently advanced civilization seemed ancient from the outside. She was old in the way geological strata were old, in ways that could be measured, counted, proven. Her earliest recorded transmissions predated the Veil Theory's emergence from their home oceans by 60,000 years. The Kethare's most ancient star charts, the ones scratched into compressed gas giant sediment, showed her ship in their skies before their ancestors had climbed out of the mud. No one knew where she had come from. No one knew what she was made of. She bled light during the perihelion convergence, a phenomenon that occurred once every 11,000 years when the gravitational tides of a certain triple star system pulled at something deep inside her. And for 72 hours, every sensor array within 4 light-years went blind. When they came back online, she was always still there, waiting, watching, as if she had simply decided to let them see her clearly again. She moved between civilizations with the patience of a tide. She arrived in orbit without announcement. She stayed for months or sometimes decades. She offered no ultimatums, issued no commands. She simply existed in the sky above a species, and they reorganized their entire understanding of the universe around that fact. The Veil Theory had been the first to formally petition her for audience. This was 400 years ago. She had allowed 12 representatives aboard her vessel, a ship that, by every external measurement, should not have been capable of supporting interior spaces of the dimensions her crew reported. 12 went in. 12 came out. All 12 had white hair within the week, regardless of their original pigmentation. All 12 spent the remaining years of their lives writing, painting, composing, or simply sitting very still and staring at nothing in particular. None of them ever adequately described what they had seen. The Galactic Cooperative, which was what 47 species called their loose coalition of shared trade routes and mutual non-aggression agreements, had spent the better part of 2 centuries establishing a formal relationship with Ethan Vel. They had given her a seat on the Cooperative's High Council, though she had never attended a session. They had designated her vessel a sovereign entity under interstellar law. They had built temples and shrines on 12 different worlds, each one aligned so that a worshipper standing at its center could look up and, on the correct date, see the light of her ship in the sky. She was, in every practical and spiritual sense, the Galactic Queen. Then, 43 years ago, humanity found the stars. The first human vessel to breach faster-than-light travel was a cramped, oxygen-recycling disaster called the Meridian Point, crewed by 9 people who had trained for this mission in a way that involved an extraordinary amount of arguing. They broke the barrier at the edge of the solar system on a Tuesday morning, which was a detail that would later appear in every history text the species ever produced, not because of its cosmic significance, but because the mission commander, a woman named Yold Farron, had specifically and loudly complained that it was too early in the week to be making history. They emerged into interstellar space, ran their sensor arrays, and spent approximately 40 seconds in stunned silence before the argument started again. They had no idea Ethan Vel existed. Nobody had told them. First contact with the Cooperative came 3 months later, when a Veil Theory scout vessel encountered the Meridian Point limping home on degraded engines, its crew surviving on emergency rations and what appeared to be an alarming quantity of self-brewed alcohol. The Veil Theory opened a communications channel. The humans said hello. The Veil Theory said hello back. Then the Veil Theory asked, very carefully, if the humans were aware of the luminant presence. Commander Farron had asked what that was. The Veil Theory had not been sure how to answer. That exchange would turn out to be the most significant conversation in the recorded history of 2 species, though neither of them knew it at the time. Because the Veil Theory had just encountered something they had no category for. A spacefaring civilization that had developed entirely outside the gravitational field of Ethan Vel's influence. Humans had looked up at the same universe as everyone else. They had felt the same existential smallness. They had built their own shrines to their own gods and sung their own songs about the dark between stars. But they had never once looked up and seen her light. And that meant that when they finally did, when the cooperative's welcome packet included 17,000 years of accumulated records about the Galactic Queen, her habits, her history, and the proper protocols for approaching her vessel, humanity looked at all of it with eyes that had never learned to automatically kneel. Commander Yold Farron read the entire archive in 4 days. She didn't sleep much during those 4 days. When she was done, she sat for a long time in the pilot's chair of the Meridian Point, looking at the star field through the viewport. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Something about this doesn't add up." Nobody in the cooperative had ever said that before. Nobody, in 47 civilizations across 3 centuries of recorded contact, had looked at the accumulated evidence of Ethanvel and concluded that something needed to be questioned. It was the most dangerous thought in the galaxy. And it was the most human thing imaginable. The cooperative assigned a liaison to the human delegation within 6 weeks of first contact. Her name was Saren Thale, a Veiltheri diplomat of considerable experience, with iridescent skin that shifted between deep blue and silver depending on her emotional state and a voice that sounded, to human ears, like a cello played in a cathedral. She was widely regarded as one of the most patient individuals in the cooperative, which was saying something, given that several member species lived for 300 years. Even Saren Thale found humans exhausting within the first month. "You ask," she said during their 43rd meeting in the span of 2 weeks, "the same questions in different ways as if the answers might change." Dr. Amara Osei, who had replaced Commander Farron as the primary human representative after the Meridian Point returned home, looked up from her notes. "They might," she said. "Answers often do when you come at them from different angles." Saren Thale's skin went the deep, saturated blue of a winter ocean. That was frustration. Amara had gotten reasonably good at reading the color shifts, which was itself a thing that astonished the Veiltheri, because their emotional chromatics were involuntary and most species simply did not pay that close attention to them. "The questions you are asking," Saren said carefully, "concern the luminant presence. These are not questions that what? That have answers? Or that you'd prefer I didn't ask." The color deepened. "That are considered appropriate. There is a long-established framework for how member species engage with the presence. The protocols exist for good reasons." "What reasons?" "Because every species that has approached her without proper preparation has found the experience." Saren paused, searching for the right word. "Destabilizing." Amara wrote something in her notebook. She still used a physical notebook, which Saren had initially assumed was a cultural affectation and had gradually come to understand was actually just how Amara processed information. "The 12 Veiltheri delegates," Amara said. "The ones who went aboard her ship 400 years ago. The ones who came back with white hair and spent the rest of their lives in what I can only describe as a permanent state of religious shock. Were they considered a success?" Saren was quiet for a long time. "They came back. That's not the same thing as success. For an audience with the presence, it is considered sufficient." This was, Amara reflected, a deeply troubling sentence. She wrote it down. The protocols for engaging with Ethanvel had been codified over centuries by the Cooperative's Council of Communion, a body made up of representatives from each member species whose sole purpose was to manage the relationship with the Galactic Queen. They were very detailed protocols. They covered everything from the appropriate angle at which to bow upon receiving a communication from her vessel, to the exact phrasing of petitions for audience, to the recommended psychological preparation a representative should undergo before any direct contact. Amara had read all of them. They made her profoundly uneasy. Not because they were elaborate. Plenty of human diplomatic traditions were elaborate. Not because they were reverent. Reverence was a reasonable response to genuine power. What bothered her was the underlying assumption threading through every protocol, every guideline, every note in the margins written by previous council members over 300 years of accumulated contact. The assumption was this, that understanding Ethanvel was not the goal. That the goal was simply to be in her presence without breaking. "Has anyone ever actually spoken to her?" Amara asked during a briefing with the full council. "Not communicated through her ship's transmission system. Not submitted a formal petition and received a formal acknowledgement. Spoken to her. Directly. Asked her a question and waited for an answer." The council chamber went very quiet. There were 11 species represented around the table. 11 different sets of eyes, compound, multifaceted, simple, compound but arranged vertically, turned toward her with expressions that ranged from alarm to what she could only interpret as pity. The luminant presence does not converse, said the Kethara representative, a being that communicated through a translation device because its natural language was entirely subsonic. The translation device rendered its voice as a flat, careful monotone. She observes. She sometimes responds to petitions. But a conversation implies an equality of what? Of intelligence? Of relevance? Of comprehension, the Kethara representative said. She is beyond our comprehension. Amara looked around the table. Has anyone tried? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She requested the complete archive of every recorded communication from Ethanvel's vessel over the past 3 centuries. It took the Council 3 weeks to decide to grant the request, because no member species had ever asked for it in its entirety before. They reviewed subsets. They studied specific communications in the context of their circumstances. But no one had ever sat down and read all of it as a continuous record looking for patterns. The archive contained 417 messages. Over 3 centuries of presence in the cooperative space. 417. Amara read them in 11 days. Then she read them again, this time making notes in the margins of her notebook. Then she went to find Saren Thale. I want to see her ship, she said. Saren's skin went silver, surprise. Then immediately back to blue. An audience petition requires. I don't want an audience. I just want to see the ship. From the outside. Get close enough to look at it properly. That is also governed by protocols I know. Which ones? Saren listed them. Amara listened, asked 3 clarifying questions and then said, all right. I can work within those. Can you arrange transit to the Kalith system? That's where she is currently, isn't it? She was. Ethanvel's vessel had been in orbit above the Kalith system's uninhabited 4th planet for 11 years. Long enough that the cooperative had begun treating it as a fixed point of reference in that region of space. A kind of living landmark. Ships gave it a wide berth, not because they had been told to, but because approaching too closely felt wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate and very difficult to ignore. Amara arrived in the Kalith system aboard a Veiltheri diplomatic shuttle 17 days later. Saren came with her because sending a human diplomat to the outer edge of the luminant presence's designated space without a senior cooperative representative was the kind of thing that kept council members awake at night. When the shuttle dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the ship appeared on the viewport, just sitting there in the dark, doing nothing extraordinary by any measurable standard, Saren watched Amara's face. She expected awe. She expected the particular expression that every species wore when they first saw it, the expression that translated across biology and evolution into the same basic shape, the shape of a mind encountering something that reconfigured its understanding of scale. Amara leaned forward slightly. Her eyes narrowed. It's smaller than I expected, she said. Saren stared at her. I mean the external dimensions. The Veiltheri delegates reported interior spaces that should be geometrically impossible based on the hull size, which means either we're missing something about how the interior is structured, or the delegates' perceptions were altered enough that their spatial measurements weren't reliable. Amara pulled out her notebook. How many external surveys has the cooperative done? The presence does not permit sensor arrays to visual surveys. Just looking at it. How many? Saren thought about it. None that were systematic. It has always felt inappropriate. Yes. Amara was writing. Can we get closer? That was the beginning of something the Cooperatives Council would later, in their formal records, describe as the human approach to the luminant presence. It was a diplomatic understatement of extraordinary proportions. What it actually meant was that humanity had arrived in the galaxy and, faced with its most sacred mystery, had responded by asking if they could take a closer look. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had even thought to ask. The thing that nobody had noticed about the 417 messages was that they followed a pattern. It took Amara 6 notebooks and a wall covered in color-coded strings, a method her colleagues found charming in an eccentric sort of way and which Saren Thale found genuinely alarming, to map it clearly. But once it was mapped, it was obvious. The kind of obvious that only reveals itself after someone has bothered to look. Every message from Ethanvel's vessel fell into one of 4 categories. The first category was acknowledgement, responses to petitions for audience, formal recognitions of a new member species joining the cooperative, the kind of diplomatic exchange that any sovereign entity might produce. The second category was warning, 14 messages over 3 centuries, each one preceding some kind of significant astronomical event by enough time that the cooperative could prepare. 3 of those warnings had been credited with saving populations in the millions. She had never explained how she knew. No one had asked. The third category was harder to classify. The council's archivists had labeled them observations, messages that seemed to be commenting on something specific happening within a member civilization without any context that made the relevance clear. A message sent to the Dorhai civilization during what appeared from the records to be a period of relative stability and prosperity, that said simply, "The song you have stopped singing is the one that mattered most." The Dorhai had no idea what it meant. They had assigned a committee to study it. The committee had been meeting for 80 years and had produced 600 pages of analysis. The fourth category was the one that had made Amara go back to the beginning and read the whole archive again. The fourth category was questions. 7 of the 417 messages were questions. Direct, specific, unanswered questions sent from Ethanvel's vessel to the Cooperative's council. Questions like, "What do you intend to do with the knowledge you have gathered?" And, "When the perihelion convergence comes again, what will you have built?" And, most recently, sent 41 years ago, 2 years before humanity's first faster-than-light flight, a single sentence that the council had spent 4 decades interpreting as a philosophical observation, but which read, in the plain meaning of its words, exactly like what it was. "Is there anyone out there who will ask me something?" The council had received it, deliberated for 3 months, and sent back a formal acknowledgement of receipt. Standard protocol. They had then spent 4 decades writing interpretive analyses of what the deeper meaning of the message might be, because it clearly could not mean what it said, because Ethanvel was a transcendent being and transcendent beings did not express loneliness. Amara had read the deliberation records. She had read all 6 volumes of interpretive analysis. And then she had sat for a very long time staring at the original message. She had then written in her notebook in very small letters, "What if it means exactly what it says?" She brought her findings to Saren Thale in a formal meeting request, which was how she had learned to get the Veiltheri diplomats' full attention. Formality signaled seriousness in Veiltheri communication in ways that direct conversation sometimes did not. She laid out the pattern on a portable display, walked through the message categorizations, showed the timeline of warnings and their accuracy, and then stopped at the 7th question. Saren's skin had gone through 3 color cycles during the presentation. By the time Amara stopped speaking, it had settled into a pale, uncertain silver. "You believe," Saren said carefully, "that the luminant presence has been attempting to establish genuine communication. Not receive petitions. Not acknowledge the cooperative's existence. Actual communication. I believe the record supports that interpretation. The council has. The council has been interpreting every message through the assumption that she is fundamentally beyond communication. That assumption shapes what they see in the record." Amara tapped the display. "Look at the warnings." She gave them enough lead time to act. "That's not the behavior of a being that considers contact impossible. That's the behavior of someone who expects you to do something with the information." Saren was quiet for a long time. "The interpretive analyses are very thorough and also largely wrong, I think." Amara said this without malice, which was a quality that Saren had come to understand was genuinely characteristic of the human, rather than a diplomatic performance. She did not seem to enjoy being wrong, but she also did not seem to experience the acknowledgement of others being wrong as an attack. It was an unusual combination. "I could be wrong too. I'm working from incomplete data. But if I'm right, then the cooperative has had 300 years of interaction with a being that was trying to have a conversation, and everyone kept responding with formal petitions and reverential acknowledgments. That would be," Saren searched for the word. "Sad," Amara supplied. "I think that would be profoundly sad." Saren's skin did something it very rarely did. It went a color that was neither blue nor silver but something in between, the color of the Veiltheri sky at the moment before dawn, which was a color that didn't have a name in most languages because it was too specific to a particular emotional state. The Veiltheri word for it roughly translated as, "the feeling of realizing something has been true for a very long time." "The council will not receive this interpretation well," Saren said. "I know. I'm not bringing it to the council yet. What are you doing instead?" Amara looked at the display for a moment. Then she looked at Saren. "I want to send a message. A petition for..." "Not a petition. A message. A direct one to her ship, that says what I actually mean instead of what the protocols say I should mean." She paused. "I want to answer her question." The silence in the room was considerable. Saren thought about 7 different things at once, which was within normal parameters for her species, and arrived at a conclusion that surprised her. The conclusion was this: The protocols existed to protect the cooperative from the consequences of approaching the presence without understanding. But the protocols also assumed that understanding was not possible, that it was the wrong goal. Amara was suggesting that the understanding had been available all along, sitting in the archive, waiting for someone to read it as a record of a mind rather than a record of a mystery. That was either a profound insight or a catastrophically dangerous misreading. Saren found herself unwilling to dismiss it without finding out which. "What would you say?" she asked. Amara had already written it in her notebook. She turned it around so Saren could read. It said, "We heard you ask. We are here. What would you like to know?" Saren read it twice. She noticed that it was not reverent. It was not a petition. It was not an acknowledgement or an interpretation or any of the things that 3 centuries of protocol had established as the appropriate shape of contact with the Galactic Queen. It was an answer to a question. "The Council," Saren said, "will be extremely upset." "Probably," Amara agreed. "Are you going to stop me?" Saren's skin settled into something that was mostly silver, with very small threads of a warm amber color that did not have a diplomatic translation but that meant, in the oldest veil theory emotional vocabulary, something close to curiosity winning out over caution. "No," she said. "I don't think I am." The message went out on a Tuesday. Amara noted this in her log with something that Saren eventually recognized as intentional symmetry. The humans people had first broken into interstellar space on a Tuesday, complaining about the timing. It seemed fitting, Amara explained, to do important things on unremarkable days. The transmission was routed through the cooperative's standard communication relay, because those were the protocols Amara had agreed to work within, and she was, whatever else she was, scrupulously honest about the rules she was following and the ones she was not. The message went out flagged as a supplemental diplomatic inquiry, rather than a formal petition, which was a category designation that had not previously been used in 3 centuries of contact and which the Council's archivists would later describe, in their formal records, as irregular. Amara and Saren waited. The cooperative's standard response time for formal petitions from Ethonvel's vessel was measured in months. Sometimes years. The Council interpreted delays as evidence of the presence's transcendent perspective. She existed on a different time scale, a different relationship to urgency. Several philosophical texts had been written about what it meant that she responded when she did and not before. The response came in 11 hours. Saren was asleep when her communication device woke her. She looked at the notification for a long moment before she fully processed what she was seeing. Then she crossed the corridor of the diplomatic station in what was, for a veil theory, an undignified hurry, and pressed the door panel to Amara's room. Amara was already awake. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed with her notebook, looking at the message on the room's wall display, and her expression was one that Saren had not seen on her before. It was not awe exactly. It was something more considered than awe. It was the expression of someone who had expected to be right and was now confronting what being right actually meant. The message was 143 words long. This was, by a significant margin, the longest message Ethonvel had ever sent. The previous record was the 12-word warning that had preceded the Kalith system's gravitational anomaly event 40 years ago. 143 words. Amara had read it 6 times before Saren arrived. It began, "I had begun to wonder if the question had been sent incorrectly." Saren stood in the doorway and read the full message and then read it again and then sat down on the edge of Amara's bed because her legs decided that this was the appropriate response to what she was experiencing. The message did not read like scripture. It did not read like a transmission from a transcendent being operating on a different timescale than ordinary minds. It read like correspondence. It read like a letter from someone who had been waiting a very long time for a reply and was exercising considerable self-control in not mentioning just how long. It said that the question had been asked 41 years ago and she had received many responses since then, all of which had been formal acknowledgments of receipt. It said that she had understood this to mean either that the question was unclear, or that the concept it pointed toward was not one that the cooperative's current membership could engage with. It said, and this was the sentence that Amara had read 6 times and was still processing, that she had been in contact with a great many civilizations over a very long time and had found that the question of genuine communication was one that most species settled much earlier than they believed. Saren read that sentence a 3rd time. "What does she mean?" she said. "Settled?" "I think she means that most species decide early in the contact whether they're going to actually talk to her or whether they're going to relate to her as a religious experience." Amara's voice was very careful. "And once they've decided, they stop questioning it." The Veil Theory delegates who came back from her ship. All 12 of them stopped doing science. They became artists. Or mystics. Or just quiet? Amara looked at the display. I wonder if they were brilliant people who encountered something genuinely wondrous and chose art as the only available response. Or if the experience was designed, somehow, to produce that response. You think she is deliberate about it? I think she's a very old, very isolated intelligence who has been surrounded by species that related to her as a deity for so long that it may have shaped how she allows herself to be encountered. Amara finally looked at Saren. Her expression had resolved into something clearer. She sent us a question 2 years before we reached the stars. And her question was, essentially, whether anyone out there would treat her like a person. Saren's skin went through the slow, deep transition from silver to the pre-dawn color again. That feeling of something having been true for a very long time. We need to respond, Amara said. The council will need to be informed. The communication protocols require. I know. And I'll inform them. But they'll convene a committee and the committee will spend 3 months deciding on appropriate phrasing and by then, Amara gestured at the display. She waited 41 years for someone to answer. I don't want to make her wait another 3 months because we're arguing about the right way to say hello. Saren thought about this. She thought about the 12 delegates who came back with white hair. She thought about the 600 pages of Dorhai analysis of a 13-word message. She thought about 300 years of careful, reverent, deeply sincere non-communication. What do you want to say? She asked. Amara had already written it. She always wrote it first. I want to say that we received her message and we understand what she means, and that we'd like to know what she's been observing for the last 60,000 years, if she's willing to share it, because 60,000 years of astronomical observation is exactly the kind of data we don't have and badly need. There was a pause. You want, Saren said slowly, to ask the Galactic Queen for her research notes. I want to ask a 60,000-year-old observer who has been watching the universe longer than our species has existed if she'd be interested in sharing what she's learned. Amara looked at her. Isn't that what you'd want to know? If you found out someone you knew had been watching the world for 60,000 years, wouldn't your first question be what they'd seen? Saren considered this. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the answer was yes. Yes, she said. I believe I would. Good, Amara said. Then I'm not alone in this. The second message went out 2 hours later. It thanked Ethan Vel for her response, acknowledged the length of time between her question and their answer, expressed what Amara described as sincere regret on behalf of the cooperative that protocol had created an unintended barrier, and asked directly and without ceremony whether she would be willing to begin an ongoing exchange. Then it asked specifically about the perihelion convergence and what she had learned from the 63 times she had experienced it. The council received notification of both transmissions 6 hours after the second one was sent. The notification described them as supplemental diplomatic inquiries conducted under existing contact parameters. The council's response began, "These communications are in direct violation of," and went on for 4 pages. Ethan Vel's response arrived before the council finished drafting theirs. It was 260 words long, which was a new record by a considerable margin. It began, "The convergence." Finally. Yes. The exchange that followed over the next 8 months would later be compiled into a document that every institution of higher learning in the cooperative eventually required its students to read. Not because of the information it contained, though the information was extraordinary. Because of what it revealed about the nature of the contact that had been happening, or failing to happen, for 300 years. Ethan Vel wrote in long, considered paragraphs. Her messages came every few days, sometimes twice in a single day. They were nothing like the brief, oracular transmissions in the archive. They were detailed. They were specific. They were, in a way that nobody in the cooperative had been prepared for, interesting, the way that a conversation with a brilliant and deeply knowledgeable person is interesting, where you come away knowing more than you expected and wanting to ask 10 more questions for every one that got answered. She knew things that the cooperative's collective scientific apparatus had been trying to figure out for decades. She had been watching the same phenomena they were watching, but for 60,000 years and from a vantage point that no instrument array had yet achieved. She described the interior dynamics of neutron star binary pairs with the casual specificity of someone describing a neighborhood they had lived in for most of their life. She explained the mechanism behind the perihelion convergence. The real mechanism, not the spiritual significance that 63 convergence events had accumulated in the religious texts of 11 species, in terms that the cooperative's physicists were able to independently verify within 6 weeks. She was, it turned out, a scientist. Not exclusively. Not simply. But the framework she used to organize what she had seen and what she thought about it was, at its foundation, empirical. She had hypotheses. She had observations that had changed her hypotheses. She had things she was still uncertain about, gaps in her understanding that she identified with the precise honesty of someone who had spent a very long time thinking carefully and knew exactly where her knowledge ended. The Kethare representative on the council, upon reading the compiled exchange for the first time, went into a meditative state for 11 days. When the representative emerged, it stated, through its translation device, that it needed to make a formal correction to approximately 800 years of Kethare theological doctrine and did not know how to begin. This was widely regarded as an understatement. The things she had been observing, specifically, were civilizations. This was the part that changed everything, not just for the cooperative but for every species that had worshipped her or built temples in her honor, or organized their philosophy around the assumption that her presence in their sky was a form of divine attention. She had been watching how civilizations developed. She had been watching them since before most of them existed. She had a record, in her own logs, of civilizations she had encountered that no longer existed, not erased by disaster though some of them had been, but evolved beyond recognition or chosen to withdraw, or simply made decisions that had transformed them into something so different that continuity of identity became a philosophical question. She had watched the Veiltheri's distant ancestors pull themselves out of their oceans before the ocean exit was complete. She had watched the Kethare develop the first version of their subsonic communication when their atmosphere was thick enough to carry frequencies the current atmosphere would not support. She had not intervened in any of it. She had watched. Amara asked her why in the 41st message of the exchange, in a question that the council later described as impertinent and structurally inappropriate for contact with a transcendent entity, and which Ethan Vel appeared to find genuinely interesting. Her answer came back the next morning, which was by then a normal response time. She wrote that intervention in the development of a civilization was something she had tried once very early in her record, and that the results had been complicated enough that she had chosen a different approach. She did not specify what the intervention had been or which civilization it had involved. She said that she had concluded, over a long period of observation, that what developing civilizations needed from her was not guidance. They had their own intelligence and their own processes for learning, but rather the knowledge that the universe was not empty, that someone was watching, that what they did and what they built and what they chose mattered to at least one observer who would remember it. She had been a witness. That was what she had been. Not a queen. Not a deity. A witness. The exchange shifted after that message. It became less purely scientific. Amara started asking different questions, not about the convergence or stellar mechanics or the physics of older space, but about what it was like to have watched 60,000 years of civilizations grow and fail and grow again. What it was like to arrive in the orbit of a species that would be gone before her next convergence. Whether she had favorites. Whether she found it lonely. She did not answer the favorite question directly. She was, Amara noted in her personal log, tactful in ways that suggested long practice. She answered the lonely question. Her answer was long, the longest message in the exchange, longer than some of the technical explanations. It took her 3 messages over 2 days to finish it, which was the only time in the exchange that a response arrived in multiple parts. In it, she described something that the cooperative's theologians, scientists, and philosophers would spend the next century arguing about, the specific texture of the isolation that came from being a singular entity of undetermined origin moving through a universe of briefly lived civilizations. She described the early period of her record, when she had attempted multiple times to establish the kind of contact she had described as genuine, and the pattern she had eventually identified. That species encountering something they experienced as transcendent reorganized their perception of it so thoroughly that real contact became structurally impossible. She had existed. They had worshipped. The gap between those two states was, she wrote, a specific kind of silence that does not diminish with familiarity. She had sent a question into the void 41 years ago. A question that she had calibrated carefully, made simple enough that its literal meaning could not be misread, sent to the entire cooperative at once so that any single species might pick it up. She had not expected an answer. She had been, and she used a word here that the translation algorithm flagged as uncertain, a word from a language that predated any language in the cooperative's records, which the algorithm rendered as something between rehearsing and practicing and reminding herself. She had been maintaining the habit of hoping. Amara read that part 4 times. Then she went to find Saren. Saren was in the diplomatic station's common room, drinking something warm and reading the exchange for the 3rd time. She looked up when Amara came in. The word the algorithm couldn't translate, Amara said. I think I know what it means. Saren waited. I think it means faith. Not the religious kind. The kind that means you keep doing the thing anyway because stopping would mean accepting that the thing is impossible, and you're not willing to accept that yet. Amara sat down. She had faith that someone would eventually answer. 41 years. Saren's skin went the pre-dawn color. She has been out there for 60,000 years, Saren said. Watching civilizations be born and die. Being worshipped. Being interpreted. And what she wanted, what she has apparently always wanted, was someone to talk to. Yes, Amara said. I think so. And it was humans? Saren stopped. It was humans who answered. Amara looked at her. There was something in her expression that was not pride, exactly. More like the particular satisfaction of a person who has looked at an unsolved problem for a long time and finally found the right angle. We had an advantage, she said. We showed up without already knowing who she was supposed to be. We didn't have 300 years of doctrine telling us that communication wasn't the point. She paused. We just read her messages and thought, this sounds like someone trying to talk to us. Because that is what it was. Yes. Amara picked up her notebook. That is exactly what it was. The council's response to the 8-month exchange was, eventually, a formal inquiry. This was their most severe diplomatic tool short of censure, and it produced a document of remarkable length that was, when read carefully, mostly an expression of institutional panic formatted as bureaucratic procedure. It questioned the legitimacy of the transmissions, the authorization of the participants, the accuracy of the translation protocols, and the appropriateness of Amara's line of questioning. It called for a review committee. It called for a pause in communications. It called for a comprehensive renegotiation of contact parameters. Ethan Vell sent a message while the inquiry was still being drafted. It was addressed to the council directly, rather than to Amara's diplomatic channel. It was brief, 41 words in the formal trade tongue, with no ambiguity in the phrasing. It said that she understood the council was reviewing the recent communications and that she wanted to register, formally, that she had initiated contact of her own volition and that the human representative had responded appropriately. It also said that she would prefer the exchange to continue, and that if the council wished to formalize the parameters, she was available to discuss them. It was the first time in 3 centuries of contact that Ethan Vell had ever expressed a preference about anything. The review committee met for 11 days and then dissolved without producing a formal recommendation, because 2 of its members resigned in protest and a third requested a 30-day leave for what the official documentation described as philosophical recalibration. The council sent Amara a letter that was technically a commendation buried under so many qualifications and concerns that it read more like a cautionary tale. The exchange continued. It changed over the following year, gradually and then all at once, in the way that most important shifts happen. It became more mutual. Ethan Vell began asking questions of her own, not the careful, abstract questions of the archive transmissions, but specific ones. She wanted to know about human history. Not the broad arc of civilization which she could observe from the outside, but the specific texture of it, how humans had organized their conflicts, what they had decided was worth dying for, what they had discovered that had changed everything and then turned out to be wrong. She asked about music, with a specificity that suggested she understood music at a level that was difficult to overestimate. She asked once about grief. What humans did with it. How long it lasted. Whether it ever resolved into something else or simply diminished over time. Amara answered all of these questions honestly. She answered the grief question in particular with the care it deserved, and the response she received was the longest message in the entire exchange, longer even than the multi-part answer about loneliness, a message that took 4 days to arrive in full, broken into 12 parts, that described something in her own experience that the translation algorithm kept flagging as uncertain but that resolved, eventually, into a picture of something recognizable. She had lost things. Over 60,000 years she had lost things. Not in the way that younger beings lost things, through death or disaster or the slow erosion of time. She had lost them in a stranger way, she had watched them become unrecognizable. Civilizations she had known intimately, that she had watched from their earliest development, had changed so completely that the thread of continuity was invisible to anyone but her, and she could not share the memory because no one else had been there for all of it. She was the only one who remembered what certain civilizations had been at their beginning. She was the only repository of those specific, irreplaceable observations. And there was no one to tell them to, because the context required to understand them was 60,000 years long. She is not lonely in the way I understood lonely, Amara wrote in her personal log after reading the 12th part. She is lonely in the way that an archive is lonely when no one reads it. The information is complete. The record is intact. but it exists for no one. This was the point at which Amara made a proposal that the council would later debate for 6 months. She proposed that Ethan Vel be invited to join the cooperative not as a symbolic sovereign and not as a sacred presence to be petitioned, but as a member. A full member with representation on the council, with the same obligations and rights as any other member species. She proposed that the cooperative formally establish an archival exchange program, not worshipping her records, not treating them as scripture, but engaging with them as what they were. 60,000 years of empirical observation, available for study. She proposed in short that they treat her like a person. The debates were long. Several member species found the proposal offensive on theological grounds. The Kethare's representative, still in the process of revising 800 years of doctrine, expressed sympathy for the proposal but uncertainty about the timeline. The Veiltheri Council members were divided in a way that produced some of the most heated internal debates in their diplomatic history. The Salvine, who had built 11 orbital temples before ever meeting her, sent a single-sentence response to the proposal: "It is the correct thing to do." Ethan Vel, when informed of the proposal and the debate surrounding it, sent a message that was 78 words long. She said that she had been considered many things over a very long time and that most of them were projections of what the species doing the considering needed her to be. She said she did not require membership or formal recognition. She said that what she was experiencing in the ongoing exchange with the human representative and the Veiltheri diplomat was something she did not have a word for in any language she knew, and that the closest approximation in the trade tongue was probably being known. She said that being known was enough. She said that it was, in fact, more than she had hoped for. Amara read the message in her room, alone, in the middle of the station's night cycle, when the corridor outside was quiet and the communication display was the only source of light. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long time not reading anything. She thought about 60,000 years. She thought about the specific texture of that duration, not in the abstract, which was what most people did when they encountered numbers that large, but as close to concretely as she could manage. 60,000 years ago, humans had not yet developed writing. They had not yet domesticated animals. They had not yet built a single structure that would survive to the present day. Whatever Ethan Vel had been when she first began her record, whatever her origin, whatever her context, whatever civilization had produced her, it was so far removed from anything that currently existed that it was, in practical terms, gone. She had watched 60,000 years of everyone else's beginning, middle, and end. And the thing that had moved her, that had made her send a question into the dark 41 years ago, that had made her respond in 11 hours to a message that no other contact in the archive had produced in 3 centuries, the thing that had mattered, was someone reading her messages and thinking, "This sounds like a person who wants to talk." Amara wrote in her notebook for a long time. When she stopped, she looked at what she had written. She had written, "Being known is not the same as being worshipped. It is harder to achieve and worth incomparably more. It requires actually looking." She sat with that for a moment. Then she added, "I think that is what we did. We actually looked." The formal record of what came next is long and complicated and involves a great deal of institutional negotiation that is genuinely important and genuinely tedious in approximately equal measure. The council eventually passed a modified version of Amara's proposal. Ethan Vel was offered membership in the cooperative as an individual sovereign entity rather than a species representative, which was a new category of membership that required 2 years of charter revision. The archival exchange program was established under the name that Saren Thale proposed, which translated from Veiltheri as the practice of looking, and which the cooperative's administrative apparatus eventually shortened, in official documents, to the Archive Initiative. None of that is the important part. The important part is what happened 18 months after the first message went out, when the Cooperatives Council formally invited Ethan Vel to receive a delegation, not petitioners seeking audience, not representatives approaching a queen, but a delegation in the diplomatic sense, a group of people coming to meet someone and be met in return. The delegation was 7 people. 1 human, Amara obviously. 1 Veiltheri, Saren, who had submitted her own formal request to be included and whose argument, which was that she had been present for the initial exchange and therefore had relevant context, was airtight enough that the council couldn't refuse it. The remaining 5 were drawn from member species that had expressed specific interest in participating and had undergone what the council insisted on calling preparation, and what Amara privately called a lot of meditation and some very good conversations about expectation management. No one came out of it with white hair. This was, in retrospect, meaningful. The 12 Veiltheri delegates who had first gone aboard 400 years ago had been petitioners seeking transcendence. They had approached a being they understood to be divine and had experienced something that reorganized their perception of reality, because they went in expecting reorganization, and the mind, when it expects reorganization, tends to provide it. They came out changed in ways that were real and profound, and that also made them, as scientists and diplomats and functional members of their civilization, largely unreachable. The delegation that went in 18 months after the first message came out with full notebooks and about 11,000 questions, and one member, a Salvine physicist whose name translated roughly as the one who measures carefully, who had to be gently reminded to eat because she had spent 3 days trying to verify one of Ethan Vell's observational records using only the equipment she had on hand and was not finished. This was a significant difference. What was inside the ship, the interior that shouldn't have been possible given the external dimensions, was exactly what it appeared to be. Ethan Vell had an explanation for the spatial anomaly that was, according to the one who measures carefully, probably correct and also not supernatural. It was physics that the cooperative didn't have yet, but it was physics. There was a mechanism. There was a logic. The why could be found if you looked carefully enough and had the right tools. Ethan Vell herself was, and this is the part that the delegation's formal report described in more words and with more difficulty than any other section, because language kept trying to reach for categories that didn't fit, present. She was a physical being. She had a form that the human visual system registered without the kind of perceptual difficulty that the veil theory delegates had described, though it was a form that was not immediately categorizable, and Amara's description in her personal log was characteristically direct. She looks like someone who has been alive for a very long time and has decided not to pretend otherwise. She welcomed them without ceremony. She showed them the archive. She answered questions about stellar cartography and the development of language and what she had observed during the second most recent perihelion convergence in terms they could follow, and she asked them things in return, about Earth specifically, because she had been watching humanity's development for 43 years and had what she described as a substantial list of outstanding curiosities. The conversation lasted 4 days. It felt, according to every delegation member who later described it, like 4 days of being taken seriously by someone who had earned the right to take things seriously. Nobody wept. Nobody experienced perceptual reorganization that left them unable to function. Nobody came out quiet. The Salvine physicist came out talking faster than she had gone in, which was the opposite of what had happened to the veil theory delegates, and she talked for most of the shuttle ride back to the station about a specific discrepancy between two sets of observations in the archive that suggested something interesting was happening in a particular region of space that the cooperative had been treating as unremarkable. She was right, as it turned out. The investigation that followed established the existence of what is now called the Vell phenomenon, which is currently the most active area of research in the cooperative's collective scientific program, and which would not have been found for another several decades if the archive had not been made available. Saren found Amara at the viewport during the transit back. Amara was looking at the star field, which she did often and which Saren had learned to read as a state of active thinking rather than passive contemplation. "The Council is already requesting a full debrief," Saren said. "And 3 separate member species have submitted petitions to be included in the next delegation." "Good," Amara said. "The more people who go in expecting a conversation and come out having had one, the better." Saren settled beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. The ship was quiet. The stars were steady and numerous and indifferent in the way that stars are, which was a quality that Amara had always found reassuring. The universe did not arrange itself for or against anyone, which meant that what happened in it was, to whatever degree anything was, up to those living in it. "She knew," Saren said finally, "that we were coming. Humanity." She mentioned it. She said she had been aware of a developing civilization in that region for approximately 3,000 years, without FTL capability, and had included it in her long-term observation record. "She watched us for 3,000 years before we showed up." "Yes." And she said, Saren paused. She said that what she had not been able to predict, or what she had deliberately chosen not to try to predict, was whether we would arrive with the same pattern as the others. The worship response, she called it. She said it was extremely consistent across species. Almost universal. Almost. She said she had wondered, watching humanity, whether the specific combination of factors in our development might produce a different response. She did not know. She was uncertain. She was curious. Saren's skin was that pre-dawn color, the feeling of something having been true for a very long time. She said our response to her initial question was the first time in 60,000 years that a species had done something she had not been able to predict based on prior observation. Amara turned from the viewport. "What did she say exactly?" Saren had written it down. She consulted her notes. She said, "You looked at me and saw a person who was waiting. No one had done that before. I had not realized until that moment how much I had been waiting to be seen that way." Amara read the words twice. Then she turned back to the viewport. The stars were still there. Steady and numerous and indifferent. "That is the thing," she said after a moment. Every other species looked at her and saw what they needed to see. Something sacred. Something that gave the universe a center. Something that made smallness meaningful. She paused. And she let them because she understood what they needed and she was kind enough not to take it away. But that meant she spent 60,000 years being whatever everyone else needed, and never once being just herself. To anyone. Saren was quiet. "We didn't look at her and see a queen," Amara continued. "We looked at her and saw someone who had been sending messages that nobody was reading as messages. We looked at her and thought, that's a person with something to say." She turned from the viewport. "That's all we did. We took her literally." "It changed everything," Saren said. "It changed everything," Amara agreed. "But it wasn't complicated. It was just paying attention. Reading carefully. Taking someone at their word." She picked up her notebook. "We didn't save her or discover her or reveal something hidden. We just answered when she spoke." Saren thought about this. She thought about 400 years of her own species' relationship with the being they had called the luminant constant. The reverence, the temples, the deliberation committees, the interpretive analyses, the 12 delegates with their white hair and their permanent distance from ordinary life. She thought about what all of that had cost and what it had been protecting and what it had been, in the end, preventing. "I wonder," she said slowly, "what she told those first 12 delegates. The ones who came back changed." Amara looked at her. "I think she told them the truth. I think she told them what she was as clearly as she could. And I think they heard it as something sacred and incomprehensible and made it into a religious experience, because that was the only framework large enough to hold something that far outside their understanding. And we?" Amara thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "We're stubborn. We argue. We take notes. We read archives looking for patterns and then we write things in the margins and ask impertinent questions." She allowed herself a small smile. "We are extraordinarily difficult to mystify. It's honestly one of our more useful qualities." Saren's skin went warm amber, curiosity and something else underneath it. "She said something else," she said. "When we were leaving. She said she was looking forward to what we built. She said she had, in 60,000 years of observation, developed certain patterns of prediction regarding civilizations in their early stages, and that we were the first species she had encountered for whom her pattern-based predictions were consistently unreliable." "Is that good?" She seemed to think so. She said unpredictable civilizations were the interesting ones. Amara wrote this in her notebook. She wrote it without comment, which meant she found it genuinely important. Outside the viewport, the stars continued doing what they did. Burning, ancient, patient, vast beyond the scale of any individual reckoning. Somewhere among them, a ship that was smaller on the outside than the inside was continuing its slow and deliberate movement through a universe it had been watching for 60,000 years. And for the first time in all of that time, it was moving toward the next thing with a full list of people it was going to write to. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. Humans had not given the Galactic Queen power. They had not revealed her mysteries or decoded her divinity or translated her transcendence into something ordinary. They had simply walked into the situation and done what humans reliably, stubbornly, maddeningly do. They had paid attention. They had taken the evidence at face value. They had looked at a person who had been waiting 60,000 years to be seen as a person, and they had seen her. It was, when you laid it out plainly, not complicated. It was just rare. And it turned out that in a universe full of civilizations building temples to their better natures and gods to explain the dark between stars, the rarest thing of all was simply the willingness to look at what was actually there. To look and not to flinch and to say, "Hello. We got your message. We are here. What would you like to talk about?"